Whoa. All right. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Patrick Carey with Church of the Eternal Logos, and tonight we are continuing our Introduction into World Religions lecture series, where we are going to be now introducing Indigenous and Native Traditions. And this is the second lecture in our lecture series. The next one will be on Hinduism. We'll be diving into the Indo-European ancient religion known as Hinduism, or the Vedic period, but that will be next time. Today we're going to be diving into a little category really described by multiple names. Sometimes it's Indigenous Traditions, sometimes it's Native Traditions, sometimes it's folk religions, sometimes historically the more negative connotation was primitive religion, sometimes it's oral traditions. Sometimes it's animistic traditions. All of these are ways in which to try to group a large variety of sort of religious formation. Again, I chose to go with indigenous traditions. But we're going to be looking into what exactly are the commonalities of all this stuff. We're talking from the Cherokee to the Ayahuasca Cults of the Amazon Basin to the Maori people of New Zealand to the Maasai of Kenya. All these different traditions, what exactly do they have in common? Their general mythologies, their structures, their societies are vastly, vastly different. And so what we're going to be doing today is diving into the sort of rudimentary basics to study and analyze indigenous traditions. And so I think there's going to be a lot of interesting tidbits. Again, this is only going to be half of a lecture. So once we get going here, I'm going to go for one solid hour, and that is it. And wherever I'm at after that hour, cut it off, and we will dive into the rest of it for members over at the website. And so don't forget, guys, if you want to have access to the second half of this presentation, make sure to go to the website and become a website member. In fact, we'll go ahead and share those links right now and some of the announcements before we dive into our presentation today. So guys, if you want to see the second half of this, along with all the other lectures that I'll be bringing out on all the major world religions, and then we'll do, we'll have a lot of fun. So we're going to be hitting it on all. But make sure you sign up. Also, if you'd like to have access to our special premium members meetings, which are twice every month, also make sure to sign up using the premium members link. If that's something you'd be interested, that would definitely benefit me and you. Also, if anybody would like to sign up for a one-on-one session, you can do so with this link here. And don't forget, if anybody's interested in sponsoring a stream, you can do so with this link here. Now, guys, I also want to say, just to give a quick announcement before we dive into the lecture here, is I will be in Florida, St. Augustine, this Thursday from the 1st to the 6th of September. The 1st to the 6th of September. I'm looking forward to seeing everybody there. Again, Jay Dyer's event is on September 3rd in Orlando, and I will also be present for that. I'll be speaking at his event along with Jamie and I forget the gentleman's last name, but a priest, a clergy figure that Jay has done a lecture on regarding Renaissance symbolism, I believe is his expertise. So Renaissance symbolism, the Renaissance generally speaking, is the sort of theme for that event, and I will be speaking accordingly on such a topic. So guys, I'm really looking forward to seeing everybody in Florida. Really hope to see you guys there. So God bless everybody. Hope to see you all in Florida. I, again, will be there in the evening or the afternoon of on Thursday. So, okay. So now let's get into today's topic. Indigenous traditions. What are they? What makes them unique? What are some of the characteristics? Well, let me pull up, as always, my famous cheat sheet. And this is not even done yet. So I think for all the premium members, I will send you guys the full copy of all my cheat sheets. But But this is one I really am not done yet, and I'll run through it here real quick with you. Here's some unique aspects that we're going to cover today regarding indigenous and native traditions. Their understanding of deities, I think that's important for us to understand. Their conception of time is different, especially we're coming from a Christian paradigm, an Abrahamic paradigm in which we have a sort of linear understanding of history and eschatological expectation. This isn't going to be the case for these indigenous and native traditions. The way they understand time is the past and the present are actually rhythmically united within a sort of temporal pattern. Time itself is secular. And so because it's circular and cyclical, they believe that every moment is in some way is a sort of rhythmic pattern of the entirety. So we'll dive into their concepts of time. I have a few things here on the difficulties of why is it difficult to study indigenous traditions, and so maybe we'll even start there before we get into everything. This might be a good place to begin. And then this section right here, I'm gonna expand upon for members. So in the second half of this lecture, my shamanic section will definitely grow here. And then I have some drugs because I want to show people some of the intoxicating substances, because this is kind of a ritualistic feature of these indigenous traditions, is that they're not going to have priests in the same way that we understand priests. They're going to have what sometimes is referred to as diviners, people who are divining or performing divinational practices, looking for answers and whatnot. But generally speaking, most of them are going to have what we call a shaman, and a shaman is a medicine man. It's a different context than a priest, because again, we're not dealing with any institutional hierarchy. We're dealing at a sort of tribal level. Maybe there'll be small sort of hierarchical structures, but the shaman is the shaman. Usually tribes don't have multiple shamans. And so we'll discuss a little bit of shamanism and why this is a sort of unique aspect, again, of these indigenous native traditions, and how this is different from when we start getting into what are called textual traditions, which will definitely include Hinduism with all their Sanskrit and the Rig Veda, the Vedic texts. Then you get into the Bhagavad Gita, you get into the Upanishads, all this different stuff. Buddhism, obviously a textual religion, has more books than any world religion that exists. Buddhism is by far the most textual to a degree in regards to the amount of text. Now, we'll look at Taoism, obviously has the Tao Te Ching. Confucianism has their sort of their book of laws and whatnot. Shintoism, technically, I could include it today within indigenous traditions. Shintoism is an animistic indigenous tradition of Japan. However, this is again important for our categorization of indigenous traditions, is that an indigenous tradition is often colonized. And so because the Japanese were never colonized, it was actually the Shinto religion that forced its power and its influence upon the Ainu people, an indigenous tradition there in northern Japan. And so typically then Shintoism, due to the lack of it being ever colonized by the West or by colonists, that it's sort of its own thing. And so we'll get into Shintoism. Shintoism will be its own day. We'll dive into the animistic nature religion of Japan known as Shintoism, but that is why it's not even included in today's presentation. And then I have this glossary, which I think is second to none in regards to a sort of glossary to understand native traditions. So again, I have over almost 3 full pages. 1, 2, 3, basically 3 full pages of terms that I think are useful for people to look at. You know, some of them are like things I've mentioned before is two spirits. This is a term unique to North American native traditions, in which they believe that there could be a man inhabited by a sort of female spirit or two spirits, and this was a term for a sort of third gender category, and this has been used to try to normalize some of the transgender and the pro-LGBTQ voices in our own society. Is that, well, look at somebody like the North American native traditions, in which they actually had a third gender. And I mentioned that within those Native American traditions, a two-spirit, an additional gender identity in many Native American cultures, usually when a male body is inhabited by a feminine spirit, often believed to have special spiritual powers, and usually they're related to mortuary activities, burial rites. And so I mentioned that when I took my course on native religions. So obviously everything that we're doing, these are just introductory lectures. If you were at a major university, every single topic that we would be its own course. So there would be a course just on Native American traditions where you would dive deeper into many of the topics that we're going to discuss today. There'd be a course just on Christianity, just on Islam, just on Judaism, just on Hinduism, all right? All this different stuff where it's going to take you a little bit deeper. And when I took my Native American traditions with Professor Flynn, shout out to Professor Johnny Flynn. Unfortunately, he's passed away by now. But he was a very fun professor, good professor. And one of the things he talked about was the Native American understanding of this third gender category and how he believed it somewhat was authentically real, and that he pointed to homosexuals and the prevalence of homosexual men actually owning funerals in the LA area. And so he pointed to us, I forget what it was, but it was like 48%, I think is what he showed us, that all the funeral homes in the LA area, people dealing with, again, these burial rites, mortuary practices, were all homosexuals. And he used this to be indicating that he believed that the Native Americans, again, that this idea of the third spirit, the sort of feminine man, the homosexual, that even that archetype or that activity is still present. Now, whether that's true or not, again, we're not here to justify any one tradition or practice, but again, we're just here to learn what they themselves think. And so, another very important term, that we're going to need to know is mana. Mana is a term that is a Melanesian term for a life-enhancing power that can be concentrated in people or objects, now widely used as a term by scholars of religion to describe the indigenous belief and spiritual power pervading all things, however, in different amount and quantities. And so, obviously, when we come back up here and we're going to be looking at native traditions, that they're going to be very animistic. And part of an animistic paradigm or worldview is that a living spirit of divinity sort of pervades all things. So this is the sort of pantheism, the animistic pantheism of these traditions. Now, that's why you need to know this term mana. No, this is not the biblical bread that comes from heaven to save the Israelites in the desert. That's not what we're talking about. This comes from a totally different language group, has no relation whatsoever. Mana, coming from the Melanesian, which has now been adopted by scholars of religion, just means the amount of this sort of spiritual energy, this spiritual power that pervades all things. You can kind of think of it as skills and talents, right? Certain people have skills and talents, and in a way, mana is the term to measure the spiritual force that pervades all things, of how much an object or person has of it. So mana, again, magically, we can think of Hermeticism and these sort of magical traditions. You can imbue non-animate objects, statues, for example, with living spirit. Well, this isn't unique to Hermeticism or textual magic, ritualistic magic. This is present within these indigenous traditions, and they believe that they can infuse inanimate objects, but also people. We're infused with that sort of spiritual mana. And so somebody who has a much more spiritual mana, that's who's going to be the shaman. He has the spiritual gifts, the spiritual talent. He's filled with the spiritual energy. We all have that spiritual energy, but it's different to different people. So that's an essential idea. Again, we'll touch more on that. Guys, smash that like for everybody who's here. Really appreciate it. So let's start getting into our overview here. Some of the unique aspects, and I'd like to definitely hit unique aspects and difficulties to study. Why are indigenous traditions more difficult to study than your typical textual tradition or your typical organized religion, right? Because when we're dealing with these indigenous traditions, we're not dealing with the same hierarchical structure, the sort of formalized presentation of their beliefs and practices like we see in the Abrahamic traditions, like we see in what we call generally the major world religions. And so these traditions don't fit with the major world religions. That's why they have then, scholars had to create its own category to talk about these primitive formations. Now, primitivity, as we'll get into, is one of the difficulties dealing with this tradition. These traditions, I should say, indigenous traditions, because obviously primitivism is perceived to be a sort of pejorative term coming from Western people or the Western intelligentsia to look down upon these traditions. And so, especially post the 1960s counterculture, there has been a major revival of indigenous, or what we would call folk religion as well. And that's why typically this umbrella, this indigenous native traditions umbrella, it's so big, because it's not just all these different tribes that exist all around the world. It is those. But it's also grouped in here is the New Age and all these revival movements in the modern day period. Now, you could temporally and chronologically separate these sort of what some scholars, instead of primitive, they call primal meaning first, these first traditions, these traditions which they believe to be first before these sort of larger organized religions, which then insinuates a sort of evolutionary process, which then doesn't really do much for many of the people who are wanting to shelter or cover indigenous traditions, protect it from any sort of pejorative connotations. Many of the people who are part of that process also believe in cultural evolution. They also believe in progress. And so it's hard to put those two together, but we're going to, again, dive into these topics a little bit deeper here. So the unique aspects, because folk religion would also include like voodoo and Santeria, but we're not going to be diving into that. I may do that at the end of our journey. So at the very end, after we've gone through all the world religions, I may do a lecture just on contemporary or new religious movements, new religious movements begins with Mormonism. That's how the Academy starts it. So every new religious formation that grows in significant prominence after Mormonism is considered a new religious movement. That is the sort of historical demarcation. So that may be the last lecture I do, which would include more of a discussion on neo-paganism, the New Age, Wicca, Santeria, voodoo, these types of things, which are technically included within the umbrella of indigenous and native traditions, because that's really the type of practices and worldviews that they're appealing to, the paradigms that they're appealing to. So wanted to throw that out there. So, okay. Unique aspects here. The first one is that these traditions are place and geographically bound. So they're place specific. When we start thinking about Christianity or Islam or Judaism, Judaism sort of straddles a couple different worlds there. So that one's going to be a tough one. But when we start thinking about like Christianity or Islam or Buddhism, for example, these are not place-specific or geographically bound. These are ideologies. These are systematic theologies that are sort of transcend the sort of the limitations of space, of the geography. And this is part of the theology because, as I put here, the literal natural environment is understood as a relative, a living entity, a relative and essential to tribal identity. This is because within the traditions, I would argue, it all has to do with literacy. That literacy changes everything. And I'll even end here on these unique aspects. I'll end why then these indigenous and native traditions are the most quickly growing in the Western world. We'll get to that here in a minute and why I think that to be true. And again, it's going to come back to literacy here. But remember, I've talked about how, for example, David Abrams in his book, The Spell of the Sensuous, talks about how there's native traditions, for example, in Alaska, where their language they believe to be the exact same language of the bird that their tribe sort of venerates. And so when the bird sings, they hear that as words in their own oral language. That there is no distinction between the sounds that the bird makes and the words in the language that the tribe speaks. And I talked about how this is part of in these animistic worldviews, they read nature, right? They don't have language in the sense, or they don't have written language. They don't have textual language. They don't have the sort of symbolic formation. Now, this isn't true, for example, like the Mayan and the Aztec cultures. These are typically also considered indigenous traditions, and these would then challenge the nomenclature of oral traditions, because Maya and the Aztecs, they had symbolic notation. The Mayas had a quite sophisticated symbolic notation. And so that would then challenge, again, these indigenous native traditions and their literacy, but generally speaking, they're oral traditions. And so they understand the nature as living. Again, this is an animistic, pantheistic worldview. That the tribe, imagine the tribe, the idea is they don't move. They want to fixate in one place. These aren't necessarily nomadic tribes. Although you could find there could be indigenous and native traditions that are nomadic, although I didn't focus on that today. Maybe that's a shortcoming that I didn't prepare for today, but I didn't really focus on any of the sort of Mongolian or Turkish nomadic tribes and stuff, and maybe focus on their religions. But these native traditions are really people that are situated in an environment, and they read the environment because they don't read books. They don't read, their minds are not working at the sort of abstract level that we cannot help but think at because of the way that we use in written language and symbolic notation. So for them, the animals are spirits. The animals are communicating to them. Coyote, eagle, the bear, the fish, they're all living, they all are then communicating to the practitioner. And so indigenous and native traditions are geographically bound. That is a big, big difference when we start to look at the other major world religions. Is that, yeah, you could say, well, Hinduism, it's sort of geographically bound in the sense that, it's Indian people. Is it people of the Indian subcontinent? And it's a collection of interpretations of the ancient Rig Veda tradition. Or you could say, well, look at Sikhism. In the Punjab, in northern India, people don't convert to Sikhism. You're either Punjabi or you're not. And we would say, yeah, but they also have a written text. They have a sacred text. And even though there's a sort of cultural boundary that, I'm not Punjabi, I can't really convert to Sikhism, but Sikhs can come to Indiana, for example, just the city just north here in Greenwood has a large Punjabi community, and they have a Sikh temple, and they can practice their religion. Native traditions can't do that because their religion is situated in the environment itself. And so we really have to appreciate that because, again, working with textual traditions, we kind of don't appreciate that. We don't appreciate place like these traditions do. Now, again, often they're pre-literate, orally based traditions. And this is a difficulty in regards to studying them because do we consider oral traditions less advanced than oral and written traditions? Obviously, historically, that has been the case, and that has then led to a sort of understanding of again, a sort of religious evolutionary theory. We talked about this in the beginning of the first lecture with theories of religion and how the concept of magic to religion to science, that they believe this was a process of the rational development of man. This was an evolutionary process. So it's very interesting to, again, why this particular topic in world religions is difficult to study is it's very insulated, right? That's geographically bound, and usually that means there's a sort of linguistic barrier. Often these indigenous and native traditions speak a dialect or a language that is unique to them. And so it's not like you can just go learn English or French or German or Italian or Portuguese or whatever, Spanish, and just go hang out and learn from them and study them. No, you have to actually learn languages that maybe only 800 people, maybe only 2,000 people even speak. So often, pre-literate, orally based traditions, indigenous traditions challenge then the definition of religion when we say they have sacred text. Remember when I looked at, we showed in the first lecture, the 7 dimensions of religion by scholar Ninian Smart, and one of them are sacred texts. And we would say, yeah, because even when you start getting into sort of the higher level forms of paganism, you can look at Greco-Roman paganism, you can look at, just paganism that exists within societies that actually have written culture. It's going to have a more crystallized structure to it, I would say. Just building cities, building buildings. This is part of our sort of development as humans. So indigenous traditions challenge the definition of religion because they don't necessarily have sacred text, because they don't write. Now, I want to be cautious here. There are, again, 370 million indigenous people estimated to exist in the world right now. Coming from, now whether they practice their ancient religion, again, I have 15 to 20% is what I read in preparation. 15 to 20% of the 370 million indigenous people still practice their ancestral tradition. But out of the 300, it doesn't mean they're all illiterate now, right? So when we're talking about indigenous traditions, we're not saying that now in the 21st century, oh my gosh, you're Cherokee, you must be illiterate. No, these people can read now. The point is the tradition and the language that this indigenous tradition comes from, it itself doesn't have a writing system. Now, most indigenous people have adopted or learned some language that has a writing system, whether it be Russian or French or Spanish or English. So I want to make that point that I'm not trying to say anybody who's practicing an indigenous religion is still pre-literate. That's stupid. Most of them are literate now. The point is the tradition and the historical development of the tradition itself has typically always been oral, and often the language of that tribe is still without a writing system. So this, because it lacks written language, we could say that, systematic theology really isn't the point of indigenous and native traditions. It's about relationships. And so that's what's going to be very different. And I think, again, we're Orthodox Christians here. One of the interesting points, I think, of native traditions is that their concepts of deity are almost always personified. So this concept of personhood, or that I as a person can personally relate to the coyote spirit or the wind spirit or the sun spirit, that these religions are almost always understand divinity in a personal relation, which is very interesting, because when we start looking at the New Age, which again is trying to basically revive and commercially and consumeristically adopt many of these indigenous traditions, they perceive divinity in an abstraction. It's consciousness, it's the universe. Well, for these native traditions, it was always about being able to communicate with the spirits or with the gods or with the ancestors. And so their entire worldview is relational. It's relational. It's not abstract in that sense. And so the higher levels of philosophical thought or the energy essence distinction, like these things aren't really going to arise in their worldview because the lack of a sort of semiotic system to get the mind to that level to some degree. So it's a much more relationally bound religious tradition and worldview, which I think is really interesting and really on point. Something that, again, I would say Orthodoxy emphasizes much more than the other denominations of Christianity. So like I said, there's 370 million indigenous people that are estimated to still be living and thriving in the world right now, but only 15 to 20% still practice their ancestral tradition. And that, again, I'm going to get to one of these difficulties of studying native traditions, is that it's sort of a sad thing, right? Because we want these traditions to exist, right? I mean, to some degree. So yeah, I know I'm Christian. I want people to become Christian. I want people to accept Christ. At the same time, there's a piece of me that does find it a little sad that that these traditions are the identity of people. They're being intentionally destroyed and lost. And I don't think that young kids, that grow up maybe from an indigenous traditional family, adopting the degenerate LGBTQ global homo worldview of the West. I don't think that's an upgrade. So yeah, it's not Christianity, it's not what orthodoxy, but my gosh, their own worldview probably protects them from much of the inversion that our world is promoting to some degree. So it is sad that it's a losing battle to some degree, because every time an indigenous tradition comes in contact with outsiders, which has been the history of indigenous traditions, because it was outsiders that first recorded them, because they don't write. So the world had, pieces of understanding of these indigenous traditions, but it wasn't really until the Muslims contacted the tribes of Africa, and then the Europeans, tribes of Africa, and then Central, South, North America, Oceania, that we really got a more holistic understanding of sort of indigenous traditions. But every time an indigenous tradition comes in contact with the world, it loses itself to some degree. And so, Rusty Beltway says St. Herman and the Alaska people is the model. And that's what's so beautiful about orthodoxy, and this is a bit of a side note from my lecture here on indigenous traditions, but related, is that the Catholic Church has not been, as I would say, their methodology is a little bit different than the Orthodox Church. So the Orthodox Church wants to, for example, St. Herman, as Rusty Beltway mentioned here in the live chat, it was Orthodox Christianity that converted many of the Alaskan tribes. And so St. Herman, they learned the language of these tribes. They spent time with these tribes. They learned the mythology of these tribes. They learned the religions of these tribes. And they started to build bridges into Orthodox theology so that Orthodoxy could come in and sort of sanctify their tradition, but they could preserve their unique identity, just like the Bulgarians and Bulgarian Orthodoxy, or the Russians and Russian Orthodoxy, or the Serbs and Serbian Orthodoxy. Orthodoxy wants to come into people's cultures, language groups, and sanctify. It doesn't necessarily want to take away or displace you or put you in a new place. And I think that is a much more efficacious and effective way to approach this stuff. But anyways, I digress. So there's over 5,000 indigenous traditions in 90 countries. Now, the vast majority of recorded indigenous traditions are all in Asia and Africa. You'd probably guessed Africa. You probably wouldn't have guessed Asia as much. Maybe you would have. But I guarantee you guys wouldn't have guessed that only 10% of the known indigenous tribes and traditions exist in Central and South America. I bet many, myself included, I was blown away by these statistics, by the way. I assume that Central and South America would have way more. And there's only 2% of the known indigenous people, 2% are in North America and Oceania, right? We know about the Native Americans, the Hopis, the Navajo, the Cherokees, the Iroquois, the Mohawk, right? The Sioux Nation. But that's only 2%. That's including Oceania, too. That's including all the indigenous tribes in various oceans in the Pacific. That is only 2% of the indigenous traditions known in the world. That's how many are in Asia and Africa. It's really surprising. And so that 2% includes Canada. I see somebody says Canadians representing. Shout out to our Canadian brothers and sisters. Yeah, so that includes all the tribes. I think the largest tribe in Canada is around 200,000. And then the Cherokee are the largest in the United States, and they're around 300,000. The second largest in the United States is the Navajo, and I believe they're around 250, potentially around 300,000. But generally, it's agreed that the Cherokee are the largest native tradition in the United States. But yeah, that's some interesting statistics there. Now, like I said, most indigenous traditions were first recorded by others, right? It was the Muslims through the 600 to 670. Remember, 620 is when Muhammad's on the scene, rampaging, going through Mecca and Medina, doing his thing. That's around 620-ish, okay? So 600 through 700 is Islamic's contact with African tribes. So that's part of what Islam is. It was the first attempt to sort of unify the Arabian tribes, which obviously touches into northern Africa. And so Islam recorded. These are just recordings, right? Clearly Europeans knew of African tribes well before 1450, okay? And unfortunately, and this is going to be my own contention with these textbooks, right? Look, I got multiple textbooks that I went through. Here's 2, and then here's 2 more right here that I got in preparation, for everything. One of my big contentions, I'll be honest, is and I get it. I get the desire for many scholars to sort of defend indigenous traditions from the pejorative primitive label, from the oral, undeveloped, uneducated level, from the colonialism. So the whole study of indigenous traditions is wrapped up in a sort of colonial lens of interpretation. Now, some of you who've gone to the academy are going to be familiar with somebody like Edward Said, I believe the Egyptian man who really developed post-colonialism. But we're talking about a large portion of indigenous tradition scholarship is focused on the effect that colonialism has had on these traditions. So you can see that's already the framework of the field of indigenous traditions is kind of framed as, it's like Hoosiers. I don't know if you guys have watched the movie Hoosiers. It's like, the indigenous traditions are the little guys, and the big mean bad guys is the sort of colonial powers of the world and how they came and basically wrecked these traditions and stole their land and everything. And we could have a discussion about that, but that's the general framework. That's the general framework of this field. So when you're reading the scholarship, it's always very pejorative about Christianity, about the growth of the colonists, the development of various countries in North America. So I can understand it to some degree. I think it has to be mentioned, the colonialism and the impact on these indigenous traditions and how they'll never go back, right? These indigenous traditions, just look at Native American traditions, right? Let's just look at the Indians of North America. They can never go back to the way it was. And that's this role of syncretism and the indigenous and native traditions, is that they can't help but be syncretic. So now you look at the North American church, and you see Native American religions, the animism, the traditional mythology, mixed with then Christianity and the ritualistic use of peyote. This is the Native American church, which I believe boasts around, it's like over 200 some members, 200 some thousand members. It's like 250,000, 270,000 members. Their practices now, these traditions are incredibly syncretic. And you can look at even, I was looking at some rituals of some Native Americans and Canadian traditions, and you'll see they may even have, I saw one guy had a piece of the American flag on his native tribal garb. Why? Again, you can understand from their worldview as animists, they're always incorporating the world they're encountering. They're incorporating it into their worldview. And so, Native Americans have had a serious impact and role within the military, the U.S. military. And so it's interesting to see, I was watching this Native American perform this dance and ritual, and then the clothing that he's wearing also has pieces of American flag on it. And then you have the whole dichotomy, then, the colonialists, they conquered the indigenous people, they stole their land. But then we have a guy who is a dancer, who is Indian, he looked like he was like in his 50s, and he then again is straddling both worlds. And yet it's the white woman that has pink hair that's telling you how bad you are and how America needs to be destroyed. And then the person who's actually practicing the tradition has syncretically sort of already incorporated everything. He's already incorporated the Americanism. He's already incorporated the identity of it being American, and he's using that as part of his Native American identity. Because, again, their worldview is it's all cyclical. So it's all coming together. It's always happening. So, so I just pointed that out. That's one of my frustrations with the general field. But 617, Islam describes some of the African tribes. We have 1450 to 1850s, the first European contact with tribes in North America, Central America, South America, and the Oceania. In 1930 to 1960, we saw several governments begin to reduce the restrictions on the practice of indigenous religion. This was true for Canada and the United States, and then also true for like Britain and France when they went to their colonies, which were in different places of the world. They would actually prohibit some of the indigenous people from practicing their religion. Around 1930, generally the Western world, the government, the powers that be began to, they lifted their restrictions. Now, you could see this in a few different ways. Is this a growth in acceptance? The pluralistic diversity mindset of the West? Maybe. Is it indicative of the loss of religious identity in the West? Maybe, right? We can look at consumerism and all this different stuff that now the West doesn't really have a religion to try to convert the indigenous people to, because a lot of people aren't that Christian anymore. Now, obviously, we're talking about 1930 and 1960, but you can get my point here. And then the real emphasis here is 1960. You guys, you have to understand that the 1960s counterculture was a monumental shift in revival movements for indigenous and native traditions. So after the 1960s counterculture, and that countercultural movement, people were really wanting to revive. So the 1960 to present, revivals found all over the world, development of global pan-indigenous movements. And so now there's collectives of indigenous groups across the world basically speaking to each other on how they maintain their indigenous traditions, and that there is, in fact, a sort of global indigenous movement, if you will. That is an important, it's noteworthy. It's certainly noteworthy that in 1960 in the counterculture, that after that, revivalism of these native traditions really, really accelerated. And then indigenous and folk religion is one of the fastest growing in the first world countries. So here, I wanted to get to this point because I think it's so interesting, right? So one of the general ways in which indigenous and native traditions are framed is that they sort of existed before technology, right? That these are primal religions. Primal meaning first. So then the Academy says they're not primitive, meaning they're more backwards, I guess, less evolved. They're primal. They're just the first traditions, which is again assuming a sort of evolutionary framework. So I don't really see how they're avoiding the same insinuations, but you get my point. So they say that these primal religions existed before technology, and so as technology began to develop, which included writing technology, meaning language, written language is a technology. That as those things got going, it created societies, it formalized more systematic forms of theology and religion, societies grew, commerce, the economy, all this different stuff, right? And so you can look at Babylonia, look at ancient Babylon and all those, Mesopotamia, all that type of stuff. So they still had multiple gods. They still had a sort of pantheon of deities, but they had written language. So they were developing more systematic forms of understanding, which aided in the development of their cultures, which then they had, again, higher buildings, more metropolitan cities, this type of thing. So the general framework then is that these traditions are pre-technology. However, one of the most fascinating aspects is that specifically, again, post-1960s, in the Western world, in first world countries, the fastest growing religious tradition, not the nuns, not spiritual but not religious, but like actually choosing a tradition or part of or the general framework, are these indigenous and folk religions. They've witnessed one of the most incredible revivals and growth by Western people. So why would that be? Why would Western people, who are really they're on the other end of a sort of historical trajectory of the development of technology and cultural evolution, according to the Academy, right? According to the Academy, that they then would in the 21st century begin to adopt and revive and begin to identify and try to participate in indigenous and native traditions that are pre-literate, that are pre-technological. Why and how would that happen? And so we see then again some of these movements like the New Age, neo-paganism, Wicca, Voodoo, the fact that these are so quickly growing and so many people are adopting them, this is part of the sort of the growth in the indigenous and folk religions, that these are considered indigenous folk religions in the 21st century, or at least the attempt to revive those practices. And so I thought about it, and I just came back to my general thesis that I always talk about with McLuhan. In digital communication, meaning the global village, as he talked about it, right? Electronic communicative devices are actually primitivizing man and taking us back to pre-literate societies. That's what he argued in the 1960s. I got his books right over here talking about it. The medium is the message and so on. And so how interesting that in the 21st century, it's the West who has all the technology, who, according to McLuhan, which again, I do believe and support this thesis, that the digital technologies are actually altering the sensory ratios, the senses, the ways in which man acquires information from his environment, that it's altering the sensory ratios of man and taking him from literate sensory ratios to pre-literate sensory ratios. That's the argument of McLuhan back in the 1960s. He said that, he believed in the internet was going to come and personal computers and all this different stuff, that what it was going to do was create a sort of global village, and that what it was going to do is primitivize people, and that the sensory ratios, he wasn't making a value claim, although he was Catholic, so we can already know probably his closer sentiments, but his work did not make value claims. He was only describing a process. And so he believed that it was quite evident that the digital and electronic technologies were altering the sensory ratios of man to take him back to a pre-literate sensory ratio. And I can't help but think that is the biggest thing going on then in the West. I've already did streams talking about the drop in literacy rates and the desire for sort of phenomenological personal encounters with the divine. Well, that's the whole point of these indigenous traditions. It's not about systematic thought. It's not about totalizing, philosophies and theologies. It's about personal relationships and about personal experience and about, again, a living nature. And so you think about then the Western world and McLuhan's theories about digital and electronic technologies and the sort of inversion of the sensory rate. You can't help but think, well, that might be exactly why then these traditions, out of all the traditions, are the most sought after and becoming the most popular for like millennials and Gen Zers to convert to. Just a thought there, right? That's not something you're going to find in your textbook. That's something that I've kind of put together in thinking about it. So you guys can discuss whether you may disagree with that, and that's fine. I'm just throwing it out there. Take it if you like. If you don't, send it right back. That's fine. But anyways, those are some of the unique aspects that I just wanted to drop just to introduce, again, these traditions, is that they're place and geographically bound, that they're often pre-literate, orally based traditions. Not all of them, though. We can point to places like the Mayan and the Aztecs that develop a symbolic notation, a sort of writing system. So there are instances, but generally speaking, when we're talking about indigenous traditions, we're talking about oral traditions. And so then the amount of people, unique aspects, there's about 370 million indigenous people. But again, look at the amount that are actually practicing their ancestral tradition. There's over 5,000 traditions in over 90 countries. The vast majority in Africa and Asia. Most indigenous traditions were first recorded by others. And then the indigenous and folk religions are one of the fastest growing in first world countries. Now, in regards to their deities, let's talk a little bit about how they understand gods and the sort of transcendent realm and stuff like that. Actually, before we even get to that, let's go back down to the difficulties and study. The difficulties to study indigenous traditions. I've kind of been hitting on these, but let's just go through them all real quick so we can just knock them out. So, indigenous traditions are one of the more difficult. If you're going to study world religions or be a religious studies scholar, almost all of them are easier to study than the indigenous traditions. Because, as I said, the indigenous traditions usually are ethnically bound and linguistically bound, and they're geographically bound. So because of that, you're definitely on the outside group. You're going to have to become fluent in a language that few people learn, unless, again, they know your language. So if you have somebody who's an insider who's English, but then there becomes questions within your scholarship because you don't have linguistic access to that community and their communicative circles. So then they'd be like, well, can you really do scholarship if you don't know their language and you're only getting like a secondhand account in English? So it's a more difficult study. If you want to be an academic and you want to study indigenous traditions, it's going to be a little bit more daunting. It's going to be a little bit more difficult. You're going to basically dedicate your life to become an expert on a tribe of maybe 2,000 to 5,000 people. But you will be the expert on them. But is that what you want to do? Is that the road you want to go down? It's a little bit of a different, approach to the study of religion. So primitive. The first difficulty, as I said, is the term primitive. And you have, again, in all these textbooks, I mean, they have whole sections dealing with the problematic categorization of indigenous religions as primitive religions. And so primitive, the categorization of these traditions as primitive had become controversial in the academy as a pejorative Western bias. And so some scholars use the word primal to mean first things. I should put that in quotes as well. To mean first things, insinuating these are some of the oldest or first religions. And so in Canada, they've already changed the terms to call them First Nations. I don't know if you guys are aware of this. Guys, smash that like, too, for everybody who's still here. I totally forgot to even tell you guys to smash the like. I hope everybody did on their own. So please smash that like if you guys can. Let me share that in the... Yeah, let's get back to it. Okay, so we already seen in Canada, they refer to these people as First Nations or First Nations people or First Peoples, stuff like that. And so this is getting back to this sort of primal, changing primitive to primal. That's what that movement is about. That's why in Canada they call them First Nations. They call them First Nations because there's already been an academic discussion regarding the problematic context of the word primitive, and therefore changing it to primal traditions. First things, first traditions, first religions. However, this is what I was just telling you guys. I don't understand how this solves their problem. Because it insinuates, if they're the first religions, then it insinuates that the second religions were built upon the first religions. Evolution, again, these sort of cultural evolutionary theories. So if the second religions were built on the first religions, and then the later religions were built on those religions, and that's what religion is, a sort of building upon process, concepts of God, concepts of life and death, concepts of body, concepts of time and space. Well, then that's the general academy's framework. Now, again, I'm not arguing that's my belief. I'm saying that's kind of the way, the agreed upon framework of the field of religious studies and how it's kind of been let out. And most of these people all believe in Darwinian evolution. Now, I don't believe in our Darwinian macro theory of evolution, but most of these scholars do. And so it's hard for me to just I don't understand this, like, avoiding the term primitive because of its condemnation as sort of backwards or unevolved, when they themselves believe in a cultural and biological theory of continual evolution. And by their own estimation, for example, one of these books, I think it was this book right here, was talking about how, maybe it was one, I forget. It was one of these four. They were talking about how, I don't want to say that an oral tradition is any less advanced than a than a textual tradition. And I'm thinking, look, I like indigenous traditions, generally speaking. I'm surprised by how few people actually came to watch this stream, because it's usually one of the more popular. Usually native traditions and Hinduism and Buddhism are the most popular of the topics of the classes throughout the semester for students. So I'm surprised that, I guess, a lot of the Christians, aren't really into, a lot of the COTEL followers aren't really into indigenous traditions, but usually it's one of the more popular days. And so I just don't understand, if they themselves believe in evolution, both macro and micro, and they believe in biological and cultural, how they can also write that oral traditions are not any less advanced than writing traditions, when that sort of defeats the whole basis of cultural evolution and writing and the development of societies and higher level thought and literature and all this stuff. And I'm not even trying to like knock the indigenous tradition. Like I said, I kind of like them. I like studying it. I think it's interesting. I think the sort of simplicity of it. I like it. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff. For example, one of the interesting things that I found studying indigenous traditions as an Orthodox Christian is like the wind spirit. Let me come down here to where is it? There's like the spirit of the wind or something. I had it somewhere. I don't know where it is. Anyways, it was talking about holy wind. Here it is, holy wind. Holy wind is a Navajo conception of a spiritual force that inhabits every element of creation and gives life, movement, thought, speech, behavior, and links the soul to the immanent powers of the universe. Now, I thought that's really interesting. There's some synonymous elements there with even our Holy Spirit. Now, again, these people are totally divorced. They did not have a concept of like the Old Testament and biblical revelation. No. Yet, at the same time, they believed the wind and the breath, they had, yes, animistic, but theological understandings of these things. The Navajo believed that the wind was a spiritual force and it inhabits every element of creation. There's your animism. But it gives life. What do we call the Holy Spirit? The Paraclete, the Spirit of truth, the Spirit of life, movement, thought, speech, behavior. The Spirit has noetic faculties. I thought, again, very interesting stuff there. So I'm not trying to knock indigenous traditions, but I do think it's very strange that the same scholars who are so concerned about the patriarchy and Western biases and the way that we frame these traditions, therefore we need to change our language, we need to call them primal traditions, we need to call them First Nation peoples, that at the same time, they're the ones that believe in these evolutionary theories that would insinuate that they're at the sort of beginning of a process that we're at the sort of end of. They believe that. I don't know. It's something I have difficult with. Okay, another difficulty in studying indigenous traditions is the orality, the oral tradition. Though not all, many of these traditions are pre-literate, meaning the original languages of the traditions didn't have writing systems. As I said, today, many indigenous people are in fact literate. It's stupid to think, oh my gosh, 370 million indigenous people, they're all illiterate. No. Their language, though, their primitive, their tribal language doesn't have a writing system. So maybe they now speak French or Spanish or whatever, and they use that to write with. And then they speak to their parents or their tribal community in their native tongue. But how to categorize oral traditions as not less advanced than textual traditions has been a problem for scholars. Again, going back to this evolutionary thing, they want to say that it's not less advanced. And I will give them credit that I think there's very interesting phenomenon and presuppositions with the sort of oral traditions that I think there's stuff that we can learn from, right? I think that, Philo-Judea, for example, had a belief, again, not a Christian, lived around the same time as Christ, was a Hellenistic Jew. He believed that the Logos was going to move from a point of being heard, the word, to being seen. And that language was in a evolutionary, now he wouldn't call it evolutionary, but he believed there was a sort of process, a sort of developmental process of the Logos that was moving from it being heard to being seen. Now, what's interesting in some of these oral traditions, for example, the Ayahuasca Cults of the Amazon basin, is that when they take ayahuasca and they go into their ritualistic activities and they listen to the Icaros, which are the spiritual songs sung by the shaman, it is visible. You can see it. It's a shape. It's a process. It's an images. It's arrows. For example, when shamans battle each other in the Amazon, they're doing it linguistically. It's through words. It's through language. It's through sounds. It's through singing. And what they do is they can, when you're on ayahuasca, the group shares a synesthetic synesthesia. This is the blending of senses. they have a synesthetic experience where the auditory and the visual come together. So things that you hear actually have a visual component. And so that's why people like Mozart was believed to had synesthetic capabilities, that when he listened to music, he saw it. Well, that is actually true for some of these primitive people. And so I'm not even advocating this, but an interesting idea is the logos moving from a process of being heard to being seen. I mean, obviously it was seen when it was Christ. Now in a way that we're experiencing it through the Eucharist, the tradition, the church, but it's still an interesting concept. It is the movement of language and communication? I don't know. But again, these oral communities, it definitely causes a problem for scholars. Like I said, another difficulty is the syncretism. These traditions are not historical artifacts, but living. Right? We want to think, oh yeah, the traditions of the Maasai people of Eastern Africa, you know how they jump up and down and they're so tall and they're over in Kenya. Well, that tradition is a living tradition. So the sort of crystalline structure of what the Maasai tradition is or should be is like a historical idealism. Like it doesn't exist. Maybe that existed, but now it exists in the 21st century. So the Maasai tradition is an indigenous tradition that is then engaging with a cybernetic 21st century reality. You don't think they know what COVID-19 is? I'm sure they do. So the world, again, they're not isolated from the world and the world that we're dealing with as well. So these traditions are living, and therefore they are not the historical idealistic archetype people want them to be. And that is a real major problem, because obviously there's a mixture of people. They want like the crystalline version of these tribal traditions, say a tribe in the Amazon that's uncontacted. Yet then the scholar wants to go to the tribe and contact them so he can study them to see and describe what it's like for a tribe to be uncontacted. But as soon as he contacts them, as soon as a person goes there, as soon as they see an airplane, their culture, that tradition changes. And we have examples with the cargo cults, right? What's the cargo cults? The cargo cults, let's see here. The cargo cults are these Polynesian groups that when they saw these cargo ships come into port, they believed they came from the gods, because they had been praying for goods and different things, and that all of a sudden what comes. Oh, here it is, cargo cults. Cargo cults, religious movements mainly in Melanesia, inspired by the shipments of goods arriving for foreigners, founded on the belief that one day the spirits would send similar shipments to the indigenous people, initiating a new age of peace and social harmony. So, Western people, then they got shipments. They are not concerned with whatever this tribal Melanesian group is doing. It's just like wasn't there an Aboriginal group or another Southeast Asian group that like worshipped planes because they came and dropped goods and then the planes left, and then they formed a mythology of the plane being a god. Well, again, that's the same thing with these cargo cults. And so we have to realize that the syncretism then is a real problem, because you can't contact an uncontacted tribe without then contaminating it with syncretic beliefs, because they're going to have to make sense of your interaction and you having a walkie-talkie or a radio or a smartphone. Imagine you having a smartphone in the Amazon and you're dealing with a tribe that doesn't have any of this stuff. Like, you're permanently, in a way, affecting the culture. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not saying that they need to exist. I'm not saying that I don't know what God's will is in the providence of history or whatnot, but to some degree, it's a contentious topic. Some people want these things to preserved, unadulterated. Some people want to study them and want to infuse them and want to send more people and negotiate. And so like the Maasai Tribe in Kenya. Well, now they pay people. So you want to come and visit the Maasai Tribe? They're more than welcome. You just have to pay a fee. And so now they have an economy, and I think this is actually kind of smart of the Maasai people in Africa, is they're basically making money and getting paid to maintain their tradition. More indigenous traditions should take note and do something like that, right? So the Maasai people, I'm talking about, who am I talking about? I'm talking about this. Let's see. These people. So the Maasai Tribe here, I think, let me get this out of the way. So the Maasai Tribe here, I think they did a great idea. Is what now they do is they allow tourists and people to come visit the Maasai Tribe. All you have to do is pay. And so now they're able to receive the sort of energy, currency, money from the world that they then are also trying to isolate themselves from. So they get reimbursed, they get money, which then can help them maintain and buy horses and buy cows and buy animals for them to stay that sort of indigenous tradition and preserve their language. They have a unique language group there in Africa. They have a unique religion, a unique culture. And so that's not a bad way to go for some of these tribes, is just tell people, hey, if you want to come hang out with us, you just got to pay us. Again, it's not going to work for everybody, but yeah, it's certainly that's why, again, these traditions more difficult to study than some of the other traditions. So let me then pull back. Let me pull our cheat sheet back up. Okay, so syncretism. These traditions are not historical artifacts, but living, and therefore, if contacted, have increasingly become syncretic with other ideas, traditions, and beliefs. To maintain the possibility of preserving, they must be isolated in some degree. And so that they could then choose to geographically isolate themselves. That, for example, the Inuit people, what we would call Eskimos, they still practice basically the same tradition, the same religion, because nobody's going up to the Arctic and the subarctic. So the Inuit people, they live in the Arctic and subarctic. Not a whole lot of people are coming up there to visit them. So they live in they are geographically isolated because they choose to live in a place where other people don't want to go. And so because of that, they're able to maintain their tradition. Now, another way that people can maintain their tradition, I should have added here. So geographically, ethnically, and linguistically. So ethnically, obviously, we see people maintaining their tradition. Not a problem. Makes sense, right? Most of these indigenous traditions, you got to be born inside of them. They're not asking for converts. These aren't missionary religions, right? Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism, for example, are three missionary religions that actually go out into the world to convert people. Indigenous traditions are not missionary religions. And so the ways that they can preserve their isolation is through geography, the Inuit, ethnicity, which is mostly all of them, and then linguistically is maintaining their original oral language, the language that doesn't have the written language, right? Even though, again, maybe we perceive it or other people perceive it as not as advanced. Well, they need to preserve it because the entire mythology, the entire presuppositions, the entire paradigm and worldview of their tradition is embedded within their language. And so contemporary groups often seek social isolation. So this is in regards to this revival movement. So this is really interesting if you look at like neo-pagan groups. They'll choose social isolation or meet in certain places or have sort of esoteric meanings. So it's hard to sort of, find the group or get into the group. I saw one scholar talk about how she studies like Wiccan cults and stuff around the Ozarks in Missouri. And so she noted that there's multiple covens, Wiccan covens around the Ozarks, and that they meet in all different kinds of places. They're sort of esoteric. They're under the radar. And as soon as more people find out about them, they'll go create a new coven. And so the woman who's sort of in charge, so the scholar who studies one of the women who are in charge of one of these covens, she's constantly starting covens and then starting new ones and moving to new ones because they want the social isolation. They want to be sort of socially isolated. And so that's kind of a attribute to some degree of these religions because, again, they're not missionary religions. They're not looking to go out and convert a bunch of people. Okay. Place and ethnicity. As I said, indigenous traditions are always geographically specific, and typically you must be born in the community to participate. As I said, these are not missionary religions. And then you have colonialism. The entire study of indigenous traditions is contextualized within the historical process of colonialism. Often scholars write very apologetically of indigenous and pejoratively of colonizers. That's generally the tone. And if you are indigenous, okay, maybe I can understand why you'd feel that way. And And I'm not even here to tell people they have to write or feel a certain way. It's just when you start to get into this stuff, you're going to encounter certainly a narrative bias or a narrative leaning slant, if you will. Now, did the colonizers do terrible things to the Native Americans? Yes. It was a different world. It was more brutal. There's less understanding. Yes, I get it. But that's also just true for history. I don't hear many of these people upset about, Christian martyrs that have died here or there. I think even though I think the colonialism is, it's unavoidable in the field of indigenous and native traditions, I get it and I respect it and it needs to be discussed. And again, the consequences of colonial, but that's where it's just like, I don't know. It's just not my breadbasket. It's not my breadbasket. I'm not really, or my wheelhouse. I don't know. I think that, when we look at history, I mean, what do, some of these scholars, like, what do they think the world history would look like if, say, there wasn't an expansion, if Europeans never did sail around the world? And I don't know, because it's what's so strange is they all believe in evolution and sort of progress, and they think that they're on progress right now, and they think their LGBTQ values are it's really hard to sort of rationalize the whole thing and the way that many scholars approach this stuff. Anyways, this has caused problems for modern sports teams who choose indigenous people and objects as mascots. We've seen this with, for example, the most notorious here in the United States is the Washington Redskins, right? The famous football team. They're in the nation's capital, the Washington Redskins. Now, mind you, the Redskins, I believe, I forget which tribe it was discussed with. Yeah, Florida State Seminoles, right? Another native symbol. That it's really interesting. For example, the Redskins, there was a spokesman that came out from the tribe that they were supposed to represent who said he did not have a problem with it. Then there were these progressive Native American activists, along with non-natives that are activists for Native American traditions, talk about how racist it is, that this is part of the colonizer America, the USDC, the fact that they would choose the Redskin as their logo is trying to demonstrate their sort of domination of Indians. Meanwhile, the spokesperson of the tribe that was actually being represented, they said, no, it actually helps notoriety for our tribe. It actually helps when people look up the origin of the symbol, it actually helps people learn about us. We get contacted. That's probably better than being forgotten. And so what's so ironic is that the activists then forced, I think they're now the Washington Commanders. So they're the Washington Commies will be short for, which is actually pretty accurate, right? Washington, D.C. is a bunch of communists. So the Washington Commies, the Washington Commanders, it's kind of fitting. But this whole Redskin Native American thing, I think, was really overdone and demonstrates the sort of polarity indigenous people and native traditions sort of occupy in our country, and why, we are very sensitive about it. We know that, it is unfortunate they lost so much of their tradition. Like I said, they can't get it back. And so imagine you were Cherokee or you were Sioux or the image of the Indian that's sort of crying and staring at nature, you can understand it. They have to basically come to a recognition that their traditions are, they're never going to be the same. But that's also part of time being cyclical. So for them, maybe they don't have to be so down and out about it, because it's all going to work its way out one way or another, I guess. But anyways, that is one full hour of lecturing, guys. Again, I got a lot more for the members that I want to get into. Concepts of time, concepts of deities. We didn't even get into the ancestor spirit. We covered so much, right? You cannot tell me these are not like, I hit you guys with so freaking much. If you did an intro lecture at some university, you would, the professor would have said a fourth of what I said in 1 hour. Okay. So you were definitely getting getting some knowledge dropped. But in regards to the deities, time, I want to do some more stuff on drugs. I want to talk about ayahuasca, mushrooms, iboga, peyote, and go over important traditions. Maybe we can look at a few real quick, before we hop into the super chats here. But this important traditions, like I'm going to really expand this. I just started doing this before the stream here. Like my cheat sheet's not even done. So I'm going to add this again. So you got like the Aborigines of Australia. Let's just look at a little bit of these people, right? And so the Aborigines of Australia. And Aboriginal is a term just for like an indigenous person, but typically now with the way we mean it is natives to Australia. And so let's just look at a few images here. So here's some of the Aborigines of Australia. Again, you can see, remember I've talked about in other videos about the scarification, body modification, tattooing, that type of stuff. We're just going to, real quick here, again, the list that I have here, do not judge me. It's very, very small. I'm going to make it much larger for the members. So the second half of this lecture that I'll do tomorrow for members, I'll have all that stuff. There'll be more to it. But, here's the Aborigines. Notice the scarification, notice the body modification, the facial paint, the body paint, piercings of that stuff, that nature. Again, these are all consistent with what we call a tribal aesthetic, And so I had one, here's a actual dance of some Aborigines. Here, if you guys, I'll just play, again, I'm not trying to get copyrighted here. But here we go. I didn't even have the Aborigine stuff. I was looking at this, so you can see the. I didn't even have the page up. So you can see the scarification, the body paint, the facial paint, the piercings, this type of stuff. This is the tribal aesthetic. These are the Aborigines of Australia, and so here is actually an Aborigine dance. And so, again, they have a concept of dream time, which is a little bit different. But you can see here, notice the, here. All right, so that's a little taste of some Australian Aborigines. Now, the New Zealand Maori. Here we go. Let's look at a little Hakka. So check this out. This is the Indigenous Tribe of New Zealand. Here, let me pull this up. So here we were looking at the Aborigines. These are the tribe of New Zealand. So not too far away, the island over, but These are very fearsome warrior people. So a little different vibe than the Aborigines, though you can see some similarities here. Again, you notice the tribal aesthetic, facial paint, body modification, tattooing, all part of, again, the tribal aesthetic. These are things that, when you look at the textual traditions like Christianity and Islam, were not in favor of a lot of the tribes. So when they encountered indigenous traditions, one of the things they often forced them to do was stop modifying their bodies and tattooing. And so you can't help but notice, again, look at the prevalence of that in the contemporary world. And do most people view that as a form of religious activity? No, but it's certainly, they view it as a form of individual expression. And so, like, if you look at the tattoo, there's actually a term for the tattoos of the Maori. I have it somewhere. I forget. It's called the moko. There it is. The moko are the names of these tattoos. So you notice how the Maori, see, they have these facial tattoos. See how they have these tattoos? They're called moko. Traditional Maori tattoos, originally chiseled into the skin, that identify the individual and his or her relationship to the community, is said to have been brought to earth from the underworld by the ancestors. Moko was prohibited by colonial rulers, but has resurfaced with the revival of other Maori practices. So we'll watch a Hakka dance real quick, but one of the ways, now they're like sort of famous for their rugby. So here's a tribal tat, right? And that's why we call them tribal tattoos. Why do we call them tribal tattoos? Because they come from tribal traditions. They literally come from these religious traditions. So here's a little look at the Maori. So we can see totem poles, masking. Here's mask, religious masks. Okay, let's check out this. Okay, so you guys get a feel for it. So that's the Maori. Again, the indigenous people of New Zealand. And so that's a little bit of what their dance is called, the Hakka Dance, which is a warrior dance. They do it before battle. And that's why now they do it with their rugby games. And so, probably certainly intimidating. If you were that it looked like the eyes of one of those Irish guys was a little spooked. But Maori, again, the indigenous Polynesian people of mainland New Zealand. Maori originated from the settlers of East Polynesia, who arrived in New Zealand in several waves of canoe voyages roughly between 1320 and 1350. Over several centuries in isolation, these shelters developed their own distinctive culture, whose language, mythology, crafts, and performing arts evolved independently from those of other Polynesian cultures. Some early Maori moved to the Chatham Islands, where their descendants became New Zealand's other indigenous Polynesian ethnic group of the Moriori. Okay. So again, if you guys want to dive more, we'll get into some of this stuff in the members discussion as well. So here's the Maori. Have you guys ever heard of the Ainu people? Remember I talked about why Shintoism is technically a nature religion. But this is an indigenous group in Japan. So an indigenous people of the lands surrounding the Sea of of Okhotsk. I'm not sure how you pronounce that, including Hokkaido Island, Northeast Honshu Island, Sakhalin Island. Okay, whatever. Official estimates of the total Ainu population of Japan are about 25,000 people. So small, 25,000. Not that many. But his is an indigenous group in Japan that is not Japanese. They are not, they are Japanese. They're not Buddhist. That's what I was trying to say. They're not Shinto. They're not Buddhists. They're not practicing Zen. They're not of Shingon Buddhism. No, they're their own tradition. They're their own indigenous people. Now, like I said, you have the Maasai people of Kenya. This is a famous indigenous tribe in Africa. You guys can look up more about them. It's a ethnic group inhabiting northern and central and southern Kenya and northern Tanzania. They are among the best-known local populations internationally due to their residence near the many game parks of the African Great Lakes and their distinctive customs and dress. The Maasai speak the Ma language, a member of the Nilotic language family that is related to Dinka, and so on. So this is what many Maasai tribes throughout Tanzania and Kenya welcome visits to their villages to experience their culture, traditions, and lifestyle in return for a fee. So even though they're traditional, they're still business people. Another really important, African group is the Dogon people. You guys ever heard of the Dogon people? It's an ethnic group indigenous to the central plateau of Mali, West Africa, south of Niger, and the Niger Bend, near the city of Bandagara. I'm not even familiar where that is. The population's between 400,000 and 800,000. They speak the Dogon languages, which are considered to constitute an independent branch of Niger-Congo language family, meaning they are not closely related to any other language. And so the Dogon, another very interesting group to dive into if you've never heard of them. The Dogon people, very interesting. The Mopando people is one of the kingdoms of the Eastern Cape, having been established way back in the year 1282. They're a tribal group out of South Africa. Have you guys ever heard of the Fang people? How about the Fang people? Fang people are a Bantu ethnic group found in the equatorial Guinea, northern Gabon, and southern Cameroon, representing about 85% of the total population of the equatorial Guinea, concentrated in the Rio Muni region. The Fang people are the largest ethnic group. The Fang are also the largest ethnic group in Gabon, making up about a quarter of the population. In other countries, in the regions they live, they are one of the most significant and influential ethnic groups, notably in Cameroon, where the Fang are part of the Ekong, a tribe that dominates Cameroonian politics, with President Paul Biya belonging to the ethnic group. And so why do I say all this? Because Africa is pretty interesting. Africa has tons of tribes, and those groups, those communities, those tribes are not always localized in one single nation. And so you have, when you start looking at the map of Africa and these different countries, often these tribal groups exist on borders or exist in multiple different countries, which makes it really interesting, because when you're looking at these African countries, they normally have multiple languages speaking in each country, multiple different ethnic groups, multiple different cultures. Us Westerners have really sort of low resolution understandings of what Africa looks like. But that's, again, something you guys can dive into if you're interested in some of that stuff. Here in America, so we also have the Inuits, right? The Inuit people, like I said, the Eskimos. That's an indigenous group. They live in the Arctic. They're not playing around. Indigenous people inhabiting the Arctic and subarctic regions of Greenland, Labrador, Quebec, Nunavut, the Northwest Territories, and Alaska. Inuit languages are part of the Eskimo Inuit languages, also known as the Inuit Yup'ik Yunangan. Okay. Language is a critically endangered language isolate used in Nunavut. Yep. And so also it's through these Inuit people and where we get the term shaman from, right? So I wonder if one of these actually say which tribe we get shaman from. No, it does not say. I forget, but it was one of the Siberian sort of Eskimo-type Inuit peoples in far north Siberia. That's where the whole Eminem Mascaria, Santa Claus, the reindeer, all this stuff is related to those groups. So, again, Coca-Cola and the capitalistic powers that be. I did a stream on Santa Claus, amalgamated the sort of Finnish, Siberian, Inuit, the various Inuit understandings of sort of, the Axis Mundi, the important term for this week. Again, if you're going to dive into our glossary, Axis Mundi, the world tree, that the sort of shaman goes up the world tree and all this different stuff. So I did a whole stream on that if you guys are interested. Now in America, one of the more important, well, actually, before we get to the North America, let's do South America. So some of the Ayahuasquero groups. How about the Ayahuasca Cults? So the Ayahuasca Cults all over. It's not limited to any one tribe. But, again, just quickly here, to hear a little bit of what the Icaros sound like. So I'm going to play an Icaro. Okay, so this is an Icaro. What that means, all that is a term for a song that an Amazonian, so if you're in one of these Amazonian tribes and you are doing a traditional ayahuasca ceremony, the shaman would begin to sing songs. And these songs would become visible. You would see them. They would be structures. There'd be things moving. There'd be different colors. There'd be shapes. There might be people and animals and arrows and all this different stuff. And it's all within his song. And so what you do is that the group gets into an altered state and the shaman begins to sing his songs. And his songs are weapons. His songs demonstrate his divinity, his spiritual power, his mana, how much mana he has inside of him. And so these songs are really, really important, and it's how he then demonstrates and helps the group because he can show them myths, he can show them things. Okay. You guys get a feel for it. And then you can do, then we'll move to the north, so then you can get a North American drums. So here, let's just go. What's the most viewed one? Let's see what we got here. Okay, let's just check this one out. I don't even know what this is. It's a native song. Clearly, it's a guy dancing with coyote or wolf. Let's check it out. You can hear a different kind of emphasis on the different tribal music. I don't want instruments. That's got a drum beat. No. I want actual tribal music, guys. What the heck? There we go. Ancestral chants. What is with all this digital music behind it? I just want a drum circle. By the way, this is the Cree. The Cree are the largest indigenous group in Canada. So this is the largest Indian group, native group in Canada. Okay. Okay, so then I'll just do a few more. Again, Cherokee, are the most dominant, the largest Indian group in the United States, and they were southeast United States. We're talking about North Carolina area is where the Cherokee live. So that is the largest. Here's the Great Smoky Mountains. Yeah, they're in the Great Smoky Mountains area. The Cherokee is the largest native tradition in the United States. Then you have the Navajo. They are the second largest in the United States. Navajo Nation. I believe that Navajo Nation, occupies, isn't it all four? It's like where Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico meet. It's like, it's right at the four corners, I believe, is their reservation. It occupies, like, it's a big square rectangle. So almost 400,000 enrolled tribal members as of 2021. Wow, so they were really growing. That's great. Good for them. So they're now the largest federally recognized tribe in the U.S. So my research was wrong. According to Wikipedia, the Navajo have surpassed the Cherokee. So the Cherokee Nation being the second largest now. That's the exact opposite from the research that I read, but this is apparently going off more recent data. So now it looks like the Navajo are your leading tribe in North America and indigenous traditions. And so the Navajo, the Hopi, they're all in southeast or southwest. They're in the southwest, and so when you think of some of the peyote rituals, the Native American church, that's going to be more related with the Navajo in this kind of group. Now, another really important group, I would say, are the Iroquois. I totally spelt that wrong. Here we go. Meaning the people of the Longhouse. Outside their community, they were known as the Iroquoian-speaking Confederacy of First Nations people. And so this is around New York, upper New York, upstate New York, south of Canada. So South Canada. It's like all the Great Lake area. And so the Iroquois was a nation of 6. And so it was based on their language, and they came together and formed a confederacy and basically became one group. And that also happened with the other important one, which is the Sioux. S-I-O-U-X. There it is, the Sioux. And the Sioux Nation, right? The Sioux Nation was another one in the United States. And they're in the Great Plains. So they moved basically from Lake Michigan area, Chicago, Michigan, that area, northern Indiana. And they, as settlers came in, and they were moving, right, because the settlers were on the East Coast. As the settlers kept moving further and further into the United States, the Sioux then left the Great Lakes and basically inhabited the Great Plains area. And that's where you have, the Sioux Nation, South Dakota, North Dakota, Iowa, Nebraska, that area. So yeah. Minnesota. Anyways, guys, that's going to do today's lecture. Again, I'm going to be going over a lot more. We'll be diving into more stuff for the members over at the website. Make sure you guys become a member at the website. I'll share that link one more time with you guys. Please become just a basic $5 a month membership will do you. That will get you into the extra content. Yeah, see, Pano says, I live in the northwest Indiana where the Iroquois used to inhabit. So it was Michigan, northern Indiana, Chicago region around Great Lake Michigan, and then eventually they move over to the Great Plains. And so the real important ones, the largest, again, the Sioux Confederacy, the Sioux Nation, then you had the Iroquois Nation, and then you had the Cherokee and the Navajo. But there's tons more tribes, guys. There's so many more tribes just in the U.S. So I'm not limiting to that. This is just an introduction, right? That's as much as I can get to you guys in the little amount of time that I have. So please sign up for a website membership with this link right here. And now I'm going to dive into some of these super chats. So first super chat comes from the Pano, our good Greek brother, fellow Hoosier here in Indiana. He says, do you see the obsession with obliterating gender distinctions, whether now or in the ancients, as a form of anthropological, alchemical yearning to return to the prima materia? Androgyny resonates with the idea of the undifferentiated one in Neoplatonism. No, actually, native traditions are very gendered and are very gendered specific in the tribal formation. So women do certain things and men do certain things. I think it's a bit of a misnomer to think that in these indigenous traditions, it's the same thing as we see in contemporary. So in regards to your description, I'd say that's totally consistent with the contemporary. So the undifferentiated one in Neoplatonism, the alchemical prima materia, I do believe that is part of the process that's ultimately ending in transhumanism. But for these tribal traditions, they were very gendered. So women did certain things, men did certain things. It's just they also, within North America, and this is specific to North America, this two-spirit thing is specific to North America. In North America, there was an understanding that a man could be inhabited by a female spirit, and that he was then he did certain functions, and that's where it was the burial rites, it was funerary practices, it was the mortuary type stuff. For these indigenous traditions, that's what the half-spirits would do, or the two-spirits. They're either called half-spirits or two-spirits, same thing. And so that's what they would do. But in regards to hunting, like, for example, in these tribal traditions, when a woman was menstruating, she wasn't allowed inside the tribe. They had a whole section for the women to go when they're menstruating because they believed the blood to be dirty, and that the men did not want to be contaminated with the dirty menstrual blood. And so all the women, so often then the women, their sisters, and their mothers, because they would live together and they would stay together, their cycles would be together. So then they would go out to the huts for a week when they're menstruating. They would all be together. So the women would be together in these sort of huts outside the sort of tribal limits while they're menstruating. And this was to purify the tribe itself. So I would say you're not gonna find a lot of this stuff in the contemporary world. I definitely get your point, Pano, and I agree with it in regards to contemporary, and for some of the ancients too. But for these pre-literate indigenous traditions, they're very gendered. Men do certain things, women do other things. But sometimes in North America, they believe there's a third gender category, but they were not interested in obliterating the gender categories. That is not part of these indigenous traditions. They're very gendered. Okay, but thank you so much, Pano, for the $3 super chat. Again, he says, do you see the obsession with obliterating gender distinctions? Well, they didn't obliterate gender distinctions. That would be a bit of a misnomer. Whether now or in the ancients, as a form of anthropological alchemical yearning in return to the prima materia. And I would say that's where you see Baphomet, for example, emerges with the Knights Templar. This is medieval times. This is before the Renaissance. And so you see Baphomet. You see some of the Greek gods like Hermes being androgynous. Those are deliberately associated with alchemy and with magic. Yes, I would say to those doing exactly this, the obliteration of gender distinction. Hermes was the god of boundaries. That's why he could transcend both boundaries. That's why he was androgynous. In regards to indigenous traditions, they're not really interested in alchemy. Their magic, an indigenous form of magic is not the same thing as sort of the alchemical process of the Chinese or the Europeans or the Muslims. It's a little bit of a different theology, I would argue. But a great point here, a great point. And so Pano says, do you see the obsession with obliterating gender distinctions, whether now or in the ancients, as a form of anthropological alchemical yearning to return to the prima materia? Androgyny resonates with the idea of the undifferentiated one in Neoplatonism. I think Gnosticism and Neoplatonism are so subtle in our society, as Pano's highlighting here. It's a presupposition many people have, is the undifferentiated one and their sort of Gnostic existential pursuit for self-divination. Next super chat comes from Mandy Makes That. Shout out to Mandy Makes That. Throws in $5 and says, thanks for all the hard work and effort you put into your topics. Well, thank you so much, Mandy Makes That. I really appreciate it. And I'm glad that you get something from it. And I'm glad you also appreciate the work. Guys, smash that like if you have not. I'd greatly appreciate that. Please smash that like if you appreciate what we're doing today and our discussion. Okay. Next super chat comes from Nathaniel Hill. Shout out to Nathaniel Hill. Says like, smashed, and then 3 ortho crosses. Thank you so much, Nathaniel Hill. God bless you and your family, brother. We got to talk soon. I was actually getting ready to text you the other day. I just been so busy. I need to talk to you, Nathaniel. We got some stuff we got to go over. God bless you, brother, and the beautiful family. Thank you so much, bro, for the $10 super chat. I truly do appreciate it. Shout out to Nathaniel Hill and the family. Next super chat comes from Stevie Weaves. Throws in $5 and says, loving these topics. Going to subscribe for sure. Also, looking sharp, my dude. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Always try to maintain an aesthetic, as some might say. So thank you very much, Stevie Weaves, and I hope you do become a member over at the website. God bless you, bro. I hope you continue to enjoy this series. Next super chat comes from Jim Helene. Throws in $20. Thank you so much, Jim. He says, thank you for the beautiful lecture. It was very enlightening. Well, thank you, Jim, for the $20 super chat. I hope you enjoyed it, and I appreciate your support. Thank you very, very much. Next super chat comes from Mario. Throws in $15. Thank you so much. He says, great discussion. I grew up around the reservation in Washington State, and I learned a lot from my native friends. Thanks for talking about this. God bless you. Well, thank you so much, Mario, for the support. Thank you for the $15 super chat, brother. I really do appreciate that. Next super chat comes from Veronica. Last super chat throws in $5 and says, if everything we do with our body and say is to glorify the true God, do we disgrace him by imitating some of the tribal practices like tattoo, scarring, dancing, listening to tribal music? How far can we take it without blaspheming? Thanks as always. Well, Veronica, I think it depends on what we're utilizing these for. I mean, obviously Christianity doesn't support tattooing. It doesn't support body modification. Most of my friends, and I know a lot of good Orthodox guys, they have a ton of tattoos, and they have tattoos. Does that mean they're not going to make it in the kingdom? No, they absolutely can make it in the kingdom. That's not the case. So people who have tattooed, scarred, danced, and listened to tribal music, or even maybe make tribal music, we have to be careful with it for sure. So Orthodoxy Church would not advocate for tattooing, would not advocate for scarring. The type of dancing would depend, right? We're not against dancing, right? I mean, for Veronica, for example, go to Serbia. Serbia has their still traditional culture. They would dance in a Serbian style. Romania has their traditional culture. You know, these different countries that are Orthodox still may have their traditional culture. Greeks may still have their traditional dancing styles. Orthodoxy doesn't say they can't dance. So I don't think that's it, or even the tribal music. I think it can affect you. I've never heard of an Orthodox priest or clergy telling you can't listen to drum or syncopated music. So I think we got to be careful of the words that we listen to, of the messages that we listen to. I think we should definitely try to avoid tattooing and scarring and body modification and piercings in various places. I think piercings in the ears, obviously, in normal places, that's not a big deal. But where they're piercing now, as the piercings where people are piercing now, yeah, all that stuff is pretty problematic. So again, Veronica says, if everything we do with our body and say is to glorify the true God, do we disgrace him by imitating some of the tribal practices? I would say some of it does. Now, again, our God, the true God, is a loving God, infinitely a loving God. Yes, yeah, she says, Veronica says, so it's the intent that matters, certainly, because I don't plan on ever getting a tattoo or scarifying myself. I like to dance. And I like syncopated music with drums. I don't listen to a bunch of tribal music per se, but obviously tribal music is a much more percussion-oriented music as opposed to sort of the rhythm and melody of maybe more European classical music. But yeah, if you have questions about certain things, I would say take that to your spiritual father, your priest. He should definitely be able to give you some tips. But I think some things are worse than others, right? So I think listening to music versus potentially permanently altering your body, not necessarily the same thing. Though I see your point that they're coming from the same traditions per se. But we got to sanctify. We got to go into these places and cleanse them from within, right? That's what Orthodoxy does. So it'd be interesting, Veronica, to see how Orthodoxy has dealt with many of the tribal groups in Alaska and what their musics are, right? Because they're under the auspices of the Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church. And so it'd be interesting to see how the Russian Orthodox Church deals with some of the native and indigenous peoples in Alaska in regards to their... I'm sure they tell them to not get the tattoos anymore and the piercings. I would imagine they probably still allow them some drum circles or dancing or some type of traditional identifying practices. So yeah. So it'd be interesting. Maybe looking into the Russian. Maybe that'd be a future stream I can do. Is talk about how St. Herman and how they dealt with the indigenous people of Alaska. But Veronica, thank you so much again, and God bless you for your journey into Orthodoxy. God bless you for your support. I truly do appreciate it. Again, that is the last super chat we have from Veronica. Let me check Rockfin. No super chats over on Rockfin. So it looks like that's going to do the stream, guys. Make sure you smash that like. Again, special shout out to Veronica. Thank you so much, Veronica. Kingdom Kid, God bless you and the family. Shout out to Mario for the $15 super chat. Thank you very, very much, brother. He said, great discussion. I grew up around the reservation in Washington State, and I learned a lot from my native friends. Thanks for talking about this. God bless you. Jim Helene throws in $20 and says, thank you for the beautiful lecture. This was very enlightening. Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you very much, Stevie Weaves. Thank you very much, Nathaniel Hill. Thank you very much, Mandy Makes That. And, of course, thank you to our mod and good ortho bro, Pano. That's going to do tonight's stream, guys. Please make sure you hit that like if you did not. And this is going to be the last stream for me for at least a week. So I'm going to be on a bit of a hiatus. I'm going to Florida, and I'm going to be with Dyer, be with Jamie and Jay down in Florida. And so I'm not going to be back. I don't leave until Tuesday of next week. Right? I don't leave Florida till Tuesday of next week. So I was thinking about maybe recording my trip, maybe making a video of it. I'm not sure. That's a lot of work. I may not do that. I may just use it to basically have 6 days where I don't think about anything. I give my speech on Saturday and I just work out, drink some mojitos, and lay in the sun. That probably will be actually what I do. And then I'm going to get back at it. So I'll be back next Wednesday, 8 days from today. 8 days. Can you believe it? 8 days without a stream. So I'll be gone for 8 days. I'll have the second half of this lecture up at the website before I leave for Florida. So make sure you guys, David says, watch out for sharks. I don't plan on going that deep in the ocean. I just get in the water just to spritz myself off, just to cool off. I'm not looking to go out in 20 feet of water and wade out in there. So I should be good, and I'm gonna make sure that somebody's further out than me always. But anyways, guys, I will be back next Wednesday, and I will be I don't know what topic it will be, but I will be doing the third lecture in this series, which we're going to be doing is going to be on Hinduism. So the next one in our introduction to world religions will be Hinduism, and I don't know if that's going to that's not going to be next Wednesday because that's going to take me multiple days to prepare for. So next Wednesday I'll be doing the stream on something, but until then, guys, as always, God bless. Also, guys, pray for me to have a safe trip. I would appreciate that. Pray for my trip. Pray for